When the data is shared by one of the financial institutions, we store it within the university. The university operates a facility called the Edinburgh Parallel Computing Centre, and one of the parts of that facility is a specific research environment known as a safe haven. We call it an air-gapped facility, so it's not connected to the internet. It's also the same data storage facility that's used to store all of our NHS Scotland data.
Welcome to Digital Customer Communications Regulated, where we explore how regulated organizations engage, retain, and protect customers at scale. This week, we're joined by Dougie Robb from Smart Data Foundry, the organization working at the intersection of industry, academia, and government to unlock the value of smart data for the UK economy. Dougie shares what a smart data future could look like and why trust and transparency will decide its success, especially across regulated sectors. Hi, Dougie.
Hi. Thanks for having me along today.
Thanks for giving us your time. We really appreciate it. So do you want to start by giving us a bit of an introduction to yourself and to Smart Data Foundry?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, son. Dougie Robb, CEO here at Smart Data Foundry. We're wholly owned by the University of Edinburgh, and we are here to open data for good, and typically socio-economic good. How we do that, we would partner with financial services companies. They will work with them so that they can donate their data to us, and then we will try and use that data for good, or try and put it out into the hands of the right people to use that for good. Now we will first of all safeguard the data that we get, and then we will curate it in order to make it accessible. And when we're making it accessible, we're talking about making it accessible to the UK academic community for research purposes, but also for use by policymakers to inform policy, to inform whether that be national policy, whether it be devolved government policy or local authority policy. Policymakers are making those local interventions. And what we're trying to do is ideally identify areas where issues are emerging to allow timely interventions. If you can identify issues earlier, then you're ultimately trying to drive better value for money.
And what sort of issues would they be, for example?
Issues around, mostly in the kind of socio-economic space. If there's emerging issues of financial distress, for example, in a local area, early identification of those issues just allows for, that local policy intervention, and by local authorities. But they're the ones with the local knowledge, but we can supply the data to help identify those those emerging issues. They can then just design or come up with the policy interventions to help mitigate that as quick and as timely a way as possible. From the data that we have, we could work with local authorities to create relevant metrics for their own area and around their own particular use cases where they think they have an issue. So that might be in areas of financial resilience, so the extent to which people are reliant on benefits, the extent to which people are having to rely on their overdrafts to fund them month to month, the extent to which people maybe, have low emergency resilience at the end of a month. And the same applies to business data as well. So we do work with some business data and get similar insights into the what's happening in the business community.
There's so much data about to do stuff with, and it strikes me that, we're on this journey to what we now sort of terms the smart data economy. You guys are called the Smart Data Foundry. That future of smart data for businesses and for consumers, what does it really look like other than a mess of data everywhere, too much data for us to do anything with, which is kind of, I think, the stage we're moving into? What does it look like in the future when everything's working well?
I think when everything's working well, to me, that means that we're working really. So we would have what I would think of as a balanced representation of data. So that would be across data from multiple different institutions, but also covering multiple parts of a financial life, whether that be the financial life of a business or a person. So at the moment, the consumer perspective, most of what we have is around current accounts, but that's just a kind of smallish part of, or it's a key part of someone's financial life, but you don't get, you're missing out on mortgages, for example, or pensions, which would be potentially the biggest asset and the biggest liability that someone might have. So I think I'd like to think we have a balanced data portfolio, if I can put it that way, but also representative. So, we'd look to address certain data gaps that might exist. So, for example, banking data doesn't have data on the unbanked. So how do we get that? But then it would also be taking account of other relevant expertise. So whether that be from local policymakers, decision makers, academics, that's one source of expertise and insight, but also the lived experience. Data is not the solution in itself, absolutely not. But that lived experience or the relevant expertise is really important. But also, then how do we bring in other data sources? How do we combine what we have with other relevant data sources? Because it's that kind of intersection or those data combinations or data linkages where you add one and one and you end up with more than two. You combine different data sources, one and one's more than two. You add that expertise and insight from the right people, and then you get something even more. So but you've also got that balance of the multiple different financial data sources in our case. And then so that to me is a kind of what would be a medium-term success for medium-term success for us, but there's other longer-term success factors as well. So, how do we then integrate artificial intelligence with predictive analytics into what we're trying to do? So it's all founded on that kind of balanced portfolio of data, but also the relevant expertise. I mean, our role in this is simply to make the data that we have accessible and representative.
Yeah. Open banking has largely been, I'd say, a success, not without its hiccups, but especially in terms of, I suppose, one of the big barriers that we would have seen before was, will people trust it? Will people actually want to do this? And that's, we talk a lot about smart data like that now. It very much seems the case that people do trust open banking and it is being used. But then when you move that on to different data sources and combining them, you're moving into territory that's a little more unknown. So what do you think needs to be true for people to trust it with more of their lives?
I mean, I could talk about this in the context of how we work. And I think one thing that's to me is really important is articulating the benefits to people. In some ways, things like open banking is quite simple because you can get the immediate response. You can see, for example, what's happening across multiple different financial products within one space. So that's really helpful to the end user. Whereas for us, I think the challenge is translating data for good into actually what does that mean for someone in the street? Because that's quite, and actually we talk about data partnerships with financial institutions. We talk about what we'd like to do with that data from a research or policy perspective, how we'd like it to be used in the real world. And it's easy to say it benefits someone on the street, but how do you then translate that into that tangible, meaningful for someone for the kind of the lay person, if I could put it that way. And I think to me, we can do that by way of things like case studies where we've got, we know that something's worked. We can talk about that and we can be transparent about that. But I think we also need to be transparent about how, not just how we use the data, but what we're not going to use it for, because that then helps build that trust with the public that it is a good idea. Because open banking relies on somebody giving their consent. That's not the model we use. So therefore, we have to be building the trust in a different way is really important.
There are different models of gaining, or in some senses, adopting trust. But I feel like in the future, there will be, if you think in open banking terms, rolling that forward, open banking does work on that kind of consent-based model. There's going to be, if there's more data, somewhere that keeps track of who we've given consent to access which data for how long, all of that stuff. And, even with just open banking and say open utilities and a few others, you can see how to the user, it's then going to be, well, I've not got all of this data admin to do, but now I'm administrating who I've given consent to, and I've got this app filled with toggles of who I've given consent to access my data. How do you think about the future in those terms and how we ensure that we're aligned with user consent, but we're not putting the burden on users? Or I should say consumers, sorry, for yourselves.
I think it's a really interesting question. I think the amount of times that most people will have been through terms and conditions, you're installing a new bit of software, a new app on your phone, you're taking out a new financial product, the amount of times that you just scroll through the terms and conditions and you click accept. Because we're all time poor, we don't really want to be reading pages and pages and pages of legal agreements, because that's what they are. And so I think what you're suggesting is, do you have like almost like a central resource that says, here's the data consents that you've agreed to give. This is what it means. Are you okay with these? And then I guess in theory you have the ability to verify or opt out. And something like that would seem a very nice way to have that ability for people to go and I kind of got a much clearer understanding of what I've done or what I've consented to, and no, I've not consented to.
Yeah, it's how granular do you get? There's going to be, I feel like in all of this, there's so much more a part to play by communications people and UX designers than the actual infrastructure behind it, because it really matters whether this is adopted and whether people use it and whether people understand it. Open banking, has actually been a massive success in that way as well. It seems sort of easy to use as a user. Do you see some of the successes of open banking being carried forward into what you're looking at?
So yes and no, I think, is the answer to that. I mean, I think the one thing, particularly when we're using data for policy and research purposes, one thing that's really important is it's representative. So part of that representativeness is also being aware of the limitations of what you have. So you might have pockets around the country where the representativeness of the data we get from NatWest, for example, is typically higher in Scotland and other parts of the UK because you have legacy Royal Bank of Scotland. Actually, once you get south of the border, you get greater variability in the coverage. So for us, actually being aware of the limitations of what we have, but also trying to work to make sure it's representative, particularly bearing in mind the idea is used for policy and it could impact people. And certainly when it's used for research purposes, one of the questions we always get from academics is there any representative, is your data, is there any bias in it, that sort of thing. So to help us in that regard, we will get a kind of a consistent but broad sample from the data partners we work with. Whereas something like, because open banking relies on consent and is therefore opt-in, you're relying on people opting in. So how do you ensure that the people who opt in are representative of society as a whole? That's would require quite a bit of work on our part to make sure that it was sufficiently representative. The other way you can do it is you could get to know the data very well, and then you talk about the limitations of it, and then you almost share it, but you share it with those caveats you're transparent about those caveats, so that whoever's wanting to use it for the right reasons is aware of what's the pros and cons of that particular data set. So that's just something we would need to be aware of and articulate to our customers. It's not to say that that kind of open banking data doesn't have its uses. It absolutely does. It's more just being aware of, as I say, the pros and cons of working with it.
And I guess for you, security is a big one as well. When you said at the start there, obviously you have to be brief when you're describing everything that you guys do. But when you said people donate data, institutions donate data to you, you can imagine how some might be worried about that, because we have had lots of concerns around third-party data selling and things like that. So how do you make sure that you separate yourselves from that ilk and you're doing everything properly and you're doing everything securely and you're taking the right approach?
So, first off, when the data is shared by one of the financial institutions, we store it within the university. The university operates a facility called the Edinburgh Parallel Computing Centre. That is and one of the parts of that facility is a specific research environment known as a safe haven. Okay, now that's what we call an air-gapped facility, so it's not connected to the internet, and it's also the same sort of data storage facility that's used to store all of our NHS Scotland data. So it's trusted by the Scottish Government for that purpose. In some ways, what we get is because what we get is anonymized, it's also, we can't identify individuals in the same way that you could with someone's NHS record. So there's actually, there's arguably an additional protection over and above that. So first off, from a kind of foundational point of view, we take the safeguarding, the sort of data security aspect of what we do really seriously because of where we store it and how we store it. So that's quite a nice, but that's actually a difficult message to talk about because then you're into technical data security, and that's quite a different topic to talk to the person in the street about. So that's one aspect of that kind of that sort of data security side of things. The other one is we have internal controls that we use. So when we are ingressing data before it's actually made shareable into that shareable format, we have ingress controls where we will review for any personally identifiable information if there is any. It doesn't get released for research or policy purposes. That won't happen. The other, we have data minimization things that we use, so we won't work with cohorts of less than 10 because that's another way of ensuring we don't, or minimizing that re-identifiability risk. The right one. So we have kind of these internal controls that so there's the sort of data security controls and there's procedural controls that we have in place. And that's before you get into, what we will and won't use the data for. So one of the measures that we use is the project safe? Is it a good project to do? Is it ethically sound? How does a researcher have their own? So say it's a researcher from any university in the UK, they need to have their own institution's ethical approval to go ahead with the project. That's another safeguard that we have in place. And, we are clear that because we're that mission-driven organisation, what we can use the data for, we can only use it for mission purposes, really. This isn't going to be used for like direct marketing. No, absolutely not. There's not that. I mean, and because I think if we were to do that, we would lose the trust of the public, but we'd also lose the trust of our data partners because that's not what they've. And in that sense, we have strict legal agreements in place with the data partners that say, give us permitted uses for what they donate. So, there's physical controls, there's practical procedural controls, there's legal controls, and there's our kind of mission light controls as well. So there's lots of safeguards around, to make sure that we are being responsible about how we use this. Because we're very privileged to get it, and that's I'm really clear about that. We're lucky and we're privileged to get it, and we need to make sure that we maintain the trust of our partners and the public.
And you're right, it is a lot to have to do to secure data and to anonymize it and protect it, etc., etc. And you spend your days worrying about this and making sure that everything is above board. But to the average consumer, it is a very difficult message to relay because
hugely
to the average consumer, data is data and it can just be copied and pasted and that's it. And obviously everyone has some degree of knowledge about encryption and stuff, but it is very difficult to explain, like you say, all of those technical controls and the legal controls and the impact of breaking these things. I guess for you guys, you've got that backing of academic and institutional trust. How far does that take you, do you think, in terms of who you're able to speak to and who you're able to deal with, having that academic backing?
So I think it's hugely important. Our structure, if you like, our legal structure it's not an accident. We are clear that being part of a university helps to have conversations with data partners and prospective data partners because it gives us credibility. It says that we are independent from, we're independent from government, and we're also independent. We're not having to, I suppose, to outright commercialize what we have in that kind of direct marketing or ad targeting type way. So being independent allows that. So it does absolutely helps with that messaging. But being part of the university, it also helps with that kind of trust messaging as well, or that conveying that message that we can be trusted by both the public and by our data partners. So I think that is a structure construct, if you like, is really important to positioning us so that we can do what we do.
Can you give us some examples of some of the recent projects that you've worked
Yeah.
on?
Sure. So we do quite a lot of work with local councils in Scotland. Through one in particular, we've worked with them. They were like one of our pilot customers. It's a really, really nice use case and example. They were able to identify an area within their local authority boundary where there was, through the data that we shared with them and the metrics that we created for them, they saw a picture of emerging financial distress in this one quite local area. And it wasn't an area where they were particularly aware of, or where they targeted their own financial support and for their own council provided financial advice. So through the work, through the data sharing that we did with them, they were able to then design a local intervention specifically around that local area that they thought would be more likely to gain traction from the local population. And that's exactly what happened. So they were able to offer their own council-provided financial advice in a much more appropriate way for that neighbourhood. And then they were able to help some of the families in that neighbourhood. So really nice example of what we do working in practice. Then there's other areas that I could talk about as well. So one might be, again, this comes back to some of the data combinations that we've created. So looking at some sort of domestic financial health metrics, if you like, and combining that with publicly available EPC ratings. So your energy certificate for your dwelling. We've then helped some research into affordability and that just transition around net zero retrofitting. So that's quite a cool project to do as well. But it's just sparked by combining previously uncombined data sources. Then I think we have I'm about to start work on a project which is looking at using the aggregate financial information within someone's within sort of the current account data, looking at people as they maybe transition in and out of the workforce at a local, at a kind of regional and local level, to help inform, policy responses around employment, unemployment, economic inactivity. So that's another really nice project to be working on. And then there's actually one more could be in the health space, which is partnering with the Usher Institute, part of the University of Edinburgh. They've received funding from the Wellcome Trust, and they have a project looking at the incidence of respiratory infections in preschool children. Respiratory infections in preschool children can lead to lifelong respiratory issues, which is then impacts on people's personal and economic well-being. So we are quite a small part of that project, because there's data from multiple different sources, which would be health data, it's financial data, it's climate data, it's pollution data, it's data around housing and households. The combination of all of that will lead to policy implications that can ideally reduce the incidence of respiratory infections in kids, which has lifelong health implications.
It's amazing.
So yeah, lots of really interesting work.
And lots comes up out of that in terms of demographics and fairness and politics. I imagine in your reporting, you have to be very careful about the words that you use and how granular you go in terms of demographics and geographics and things like that.
Yeah, so and part of that is for example, some of the data we get will have a geographic marker, so we don't know exact location, or we don't know someone's house, for example, but we know it down to like a neighborhood level or lower super. We can see it as low as lower super output area. We also know someone's age within 5 years, and we know whether someone's male or female. And because we can see, current account banking activity, we can have an estimate at people's net salaries after tax, that sort of thing. So we could put people into income brackets. So that would be the kind of the broad demographic markers that we can see and that allow us to do some work. Now, our role in this is really strictly on the data curation and data sharing side. When it comes to actually that kind of written output or the policy making decisions, that's up to that research outputs and drawing conclusions based on the data that's being worked with. That's up to our users to do all that, albeit within the safeguards of pre-approved project scope, and everyone being comfortable that it's being used for the right reasons and it's a good bit of work to do.
It makes you think, though. I mean, the scope of, or the range of those case studies that you just gave are impressive, and it only makes your mind jump to, 20 years time when all of our data is being fed into one big AI brain and, all of those kind of movie-like features. You're right. Once you even combine two data sources that haven't been combined before, you can actually tell quite a lot. Once you combine 3 or 4 or 5, okay, you might not know the individual person, but when they come to interact with something and the processes that they interact with are getting influenced by that data, you can see how it can then become troubling. It's going to be a long time till we get to that scale, but it's not like we're not on that journey, because the benefits are so massive. You must have considered the impact of AI. Do you use AI at the moment on processing your data, things like that?
No, we don't. We are about to start a piece of work to look at using language models within a very controlled air-gapped environment. So it's because these, you'll know yourself, the way these models are trained is on access to data, and it's usually based on open data and whatever they can grab. So for us to be using those types of models, we need to know that nothing is getting back to the mothership, so to speak. For us to be using these kind of tools, we need to do it in a very controlled way, in a very safe way, which is, there is nothing. It's a secure environment where nothing gets out. But I think where we see the use for these is actually to help the researchers. Not everybody can work successfully with the types of data sets that we have. So in actual fact, to make that sort of service a bit more accessible, actually to use those sorts of language models within that type of environment is potentially helpful to researchers. It maybe means that they can do more and they can do it faster, and more researchers can do it. So that's one way in which we'd like to be able to use it. It's not a way we're using it at the moment, but that's the sort of thing that's on the cards. And then I think from a policy perspective, where we'd like to see it is actually thinking about predictive analytics. So actually taking what we have, once we've got a sufficient longitudinal aspect of sufficient longitudinal sample, and then using those multiple data sources or multiple data combinations, and actually thinking about what modeling can we do around predictive analytics to allow policymakers to respond even quicker to issues. So that's where that's the two areas that's on we're two applications that we have in mind at the moment.
And when you say predictive analytics, we're talking, rather than policymakers going, might be that we have an issue here, let's do some research on it. It's what are the issues, flag any potential issues, that kind of thing, more open question type of research.
Yeah, so this wouldn't necessarily be well, you could use it for research purposes, but I think this is more about, so the way in which we make data available for policymakers is highly curated. It's like map-based dashboards. But within those dashboards, there's also, you can see time series data as well, for example. You could see that introducing probabilistic predictive, I suppose, forecast outcomes, if you like, would be a next step. And that's it's that kind of, so that's what I mean. If you've got that, the sufficient time series, and you've got the data combinations to work with, then you can then think about, okay, what might happen in 12 months' time, or where might, if a pattern is emerging just now, how might that pattern continue to develop?
And in the future, would you be looking at things like something else AI is particularly good at is looking at data that might not be in the right format and then processing it to put it in the right format to standardize it? I imagine something like that would be very useful to you guys as well.
Yeah, for sure. And that would be another sensible thing for us to look at and apply over time as well.
Fraught with bigger considerations around risk and compliance, probably. So, yeah.
Absolutely.
Sensible baby steps.
And typically that's exactly how we operate. I mean, we don't, when we do something for the first time, it is at small scale. And that's, one of the ways in which, so I've talked a bit about building trust. So for us, when it comes to building trust with a data partner, then, we one of the ways in which we try and do that is to say, well, if we could agree on a use case that you're interested in and that works for us, then let's try let's try that, but let's try it at a small scale to get people comfortable with working with each other. That's just quite a nice way to, as I say, to develop that trust and prove that something works before you then take the next step, which is, okay, it works on a smallish sample of data in one specific location, then we can take the next step, which is to start thinking about scaling it up.
You're not dealing with the kind of data where you can move fast and break things, no. Especially when you talk about, how it can influence on the ground activity, you can see the importance of it.
Yeah, and I think it is that it's translating what we do into, as I say, go back to something I said earlier, is translating what we do into something that means that's got that practical resonance with people, so that they go, yes, this is a good idea.
And what are you, to wrap up, we have to let you go soon, but to wrap up, what are you most excited about over the next year or so, couple of years, 6 months?
So a couple of the projects that I mentioned earlier, seeing those through to whether that be, if we can help out with sort of workforce policy, that would be a fantastic thing for us to be involved in. If we can do that sort of proof of concept around the language models within that safeguarded air-gapped environment, that would be fantastic for us to be able to do that. And I think if we can curate, more success case studies of that practical policy application that helps, that really helps people, and that would be fantastic. Just expanding our network of data partners, because I do see a safeguard as having multiple data partners. Safeguard in several ways. If we have additional data, then it probably gives better efficacy to some of the decisions that might be being made. So that's important. But also we're not necessarily attributing decisions to one particular data partner or another particular data partner. So there's it does de-risk it from that point of view. So, but actually having just better representativeness across data partners, but also across data sources, whether that be or financial products, is probably a better way to put it. So making sure that we are getting that
areas coverage, of your financial life.
Yeah, exactly. Coverage in all aspects of what that means.
And if anyone does want to get in touch after this podcast, how do they get in touch with you and with Smart Data Foundry?
So people are welcome to email me at dougie.robb@smartdatafoundry.com. You can also register for a free demonstration on our website, smartdatafoundry.com. And there's also a contact form on our website as well, as you'd probably expect.
Well, we are losing light. You are losing light. You're sitting in the dark soon. So we will let you go. Thank you so much for your time today. Dougie Robb, we'll speak to you soon.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Cheers. Bye.